All right. Our first speaker is Dr. Frank de la Teja. He is Regents Professor Emeritus and University Distinguished Professor Emeritus of History at Texas State University in San Marcos. He got his PhD in Latin American history from UT Austin. He's worked at the Texas General Land Office. He has been heavily involved in the Texas State Historical Association, involved in many boards. His research specializes in the Spanish, Mexican, and Republic era of Texas, and his award-winning book, San Antonio de Béjar, A Community on New Spain's Northern Frontier. I believe that was 1995. And I must add, was on my top list of books that influenced me when I was in graduate school to really get into that area, at least into the Spanish Texas period. And most recently, Faces of Béjar, Writings on Early San Antonio and Texas. And as I mentioned, involved heavily in the Texas State Historical Association, where he's a fellow, and he was also a state historian, I believe, the first one appointed by Governor Perry. Gosh, it seems like so long ago already. So without further ado, Dr. Frank de la Teja.
Thank you, Francis. Everything seems long ago now. And I do have the sad news to report. Some of you knew him, and some of you knew of him, and some of us worked with him for a while. Felix Almaraz passed away, and so you might want to keep him in your thoughts if you do remember Felix. He was quite the character, wearing his beret wherever he went, and being very, very formal. He liked to call me Don Francisco. So we remember him this morning as we cover some of the material that he was also very much interested in his career. I hope that you find it my presentation as kind of a chain in a long line of people who've been interested in understanding how we got to the Texas that we have today. Anyway, I also have to, before I move on, I want to thank Mary Margaret for inviting me, and Maurice and the Woody for hosting me today. You know, they've done it in the past, and they've asked me back, so I couldn't have screwed up too badly. And I also want to mention that there are connections in all kinds of ways between the material that's being offered today, and I'll just mention one from the previous presentation that was made. Both Gentils and Fratellier were very sympathetic to the Tejano, to the Mexican-Texan population. It's evident in Gentil's paintings, which I use to illustrate my book, Faces of Béjar. Each chapter is preceded by a Gentil's painting in which I try to contextualize the material that's in that chapter. And Fretillier's writings on life in San Antonio in the 1840s, 1850s is also very sympathetic to the Tejano population, and I emphasize that because, unfortunately, the vast majority of the Anglo-American, Anglo-Texan population was not very sympathetic. The struggles of the Tejano community in the 19th century in San Antonio, the town that they established and founded, found them actually struggling to be recognized as the building blocks, the foundational building blocks of the city. So I'll leave that there for your consideration. So today's presentation, Erasmo Seguín and the Paradox of Loyalty, begins actually with a quote with somebody who actually was at least sympathetic to Erasmo. In justice to the name of Seguín, let me add that no Mexican ever did more for Texas and the colonists than did the true-hearted man. In the infancy of Texas, in the days of her weakness and his strength, he was the faithful friend of the American, Would I could say the same of the Americans toward him. A man of intelligence and position, having the confidence of his government, through him, Austin obtained many favors for the colonists. So wrote Guy M. Bryan, nephew of Stephen F. Austin, in late 1852, 5 years before Erasmo's death at age 75. There are a couple of interesting observations in Bryan's comments. First, in his identification of Erasmo as a Mexican, who more than any other helped the cause of Texas and the colonists. Bryan betrays the prevailing bias that the Mexican-Texan population was somehow not fully Texan. He doesn't use a term that Jose Antonio Navarro, Juan Seguín, and some of the Anglo-Texans used, Mexico-Texan, just Mexican. At the same time, he acknowledges that Erasmo was not only good to Americans, but that he may not have been well treated by them. Would that I could say the same of the Americans toward him. It isn't Bryan's comment about Erasmo that makes Seguín a fit subject for historical study. They just confirm that an honest consideration of how modern Texas came to be cannot ignore the participation of Tejanos, that is, the Texans of Mexican heritage. Erasmo, then, becomes a lens through which we can consider the place of Tejanos within the greater sweep of Texas history, and yet, over the years, despite the appearance of Erasmo in the occasional scholarly article or book about Mexican Texas and the Revolution, what common knowledge there is of him has been reduced to just a couple of facts. He was the man commissioned by Governor Antonio Martinez to bring Moses Austin news that his colonial project had been approved. And 2, he was the father of Juan Nepomuceno Seguín, the controversial Revolutionary War military hero. Those events marked the second part of his public life, when his allegiances were to Mexico and later the Republic of Texas. There is, however, an earlier part of Erasmo's public career that ties him to a much neglected aspect of Texas history, the final years of Spanish rule. In that story, we find the roots of the conflicted loyalties that Bejareños expressed in the post-Mexican independence period. The Texas revolts of 1811 and 1812-1813, which pitted friend against friend and family member against family member, as all civil wars do. And that's what the Mexican War of Independence was. It was actually a civil war. It was fought mostly between Mexicans. Had repercussions that lasted through Texas independence and beyond, and are no less part of Texas history than the Revolution of 1835-36. It is a story, therefore, that reminds us that we cannot hope to fully understand the dynamics of Texas history after 1821 unless we better understand the dynamics of Texas history before 1821. The story, and by the way, we don't have time for all aspects of Texas history, so I'm very glad that Francis put in the indigenous part of that story, which has also often been very neglected, except to make of the Indians, of the indigenous people, the boogeymen in the story. The story of Erasmo's treason trial offers an important opportunity for just such an understanding. On the eve of the Mexican War of Independence, Erasmo owned, aside from farmland close to town, the 22,000-acre La Mora Ranch, once belonging to Mission Valero, 500 head of cattle, 20 horses, plus a mule breeding herd of jacks and mares. To manage his property, he employed 5 ranch hands. He had a wife and 2 children, and he was serving as the local postmaster. To all appearances, there would seem to be little motivation for Erasmo to abandon loyalty to the crown when rebellion came to the viceroyalty. He was an insider. After Hidalgo's cry of death to bad government in September 1810, a widespread insurrection broke out throughout northeastern New Spain that made the people of Texas particularly fearful. The governor continually called for the loyalty of Tejanos, but rumors and conspiracies were impossible to stop. Between the end of 1810 and early 1811, the royal governors of Nuevo Santander, what is now Tamaulipas, Nuevo León, and Coahuila were all overthrown by insurgents claiming loyalty to Ferdinand VII, but rejecting viceregal authority. Very confusing times. On January 18, less than a week before he was overthrown, Governor Manuel Salcedo, and again Felix Almaraz, he wrote the biography of Manuel Salcedo. You can I think UT Press might still have a paperback in print. You can certainly find it on Amazon. Governor Manuel Salcedo called together the area's military officers, the municipal council, and selected other citizens to explain the situation and attempt to gain a vote of confidence. 31 officers and citizens signed declarations of obedience to the governor, loyalty to Ferdinand, and faithfulness to the church, including Erasmo, who went out of his way to mention in his affidavit, quote, "the rabble of evil men who rob us of our tranquility." He is no fire eater. The collective show of loyalty did not prevent Juan de las Casas, a militia officer from Nuevo Santander making his home in San Antonio, from convincing the garrison to revolt against Governor Salcedo. But resistance to Casas' coup really quickly developed among the local citizenship, including Erasmo. In early March 1811, a large group of the town's leaders, led by Juan Manuel Zambrano and including Seguín, carried out a counter-revolt. Quickly, the town's leadership drew up a declaration of their loyalty to the crown, and Erasmo signed on. In his report of events and how the junta came to take control, Zambrano singled out Erasmo. Quote, "Likewise, we were greatly pleased with Don Erasmo Seguín, the postmaster of this capital, who knew to advise many of his friends and countrymen to come to the defense of the just cause, being, as we have said, one of the first to join in raising his voice against the insurgents." For his role, the Commandant General appointed him a brevet captain of provincial militias, something that will actually surface during the early Mexican period when he's actually going to be made commander of the local militia. I mean, it's a very interesting and complicated, convoluted story. The junta's trust of Seguín is clear from the various assignments given him, including sending him to Natchitoches or Rapides in search of supplies for the troops stationed in San Antonio. Less than a month later, the junta informed Seguín that he was to remain at Natchitoches to assist Adjutant Inspector Cristobal Dominguez, who was in command there, because of reports received of, quote, "movements that the Anglo-Americans are making against our possessions as a result of the insurrection in this kingdom." The royal government's trust in Erasmo continued. In October 1811, Governor Salcedo, needing to place the position, quote, "in the hands of an individual combining the necessary circumstances and qualities for its legal exercise," appointed him interim representative of the royal monopolies in San Antonio. The position extended his network of commercial connections, since he would be dealing with officials and merchants in Texas and Coahuila. In August 1812, José Bernardo Gutiérrez de Lara and Augustus McGee began their campaign to remove Texas from viceregal control. Capturing Natchitoches without firing a shot, the insurgent army captured La Bahia in the fall, withstood a siege of royalists until early 1813, and then marched on San Antonio. After accepting Governor Manuel Salcedo's surrender at the end of March 1813, Gutiérrez de Lara and a handful of Bejareños began the task of setting up an independent Mexico in Texas. Among their actions was the arrest of known royalists in town, Erasmo included. After a few weeks under house arrest, Erasmo was freed after agreeing to go with the rebels, with a rebel delegation to Louisiana in search of reinforcements and supplies. And you see how Louisiana keeps popping up. It's nothing that happens later. It's all the way through Texas history. It's that relationship to Louisiana. While there, he wrote letters of introduction for professional revolutionary José Álvarez de Toledo, who replaced Gutiérrez de Lara as head of the insurgency in Texas in July, just in time to face the approaching royalist army under Commandant General Joaquín de Arredondo. At the Battle of Medina on August 18, 1813, the bloodiest battle ever fought on Texas soil that there's a record of, Arredondo defeated the Republican Army of the North and reestablished royalist rule. By early September 1813, Texas was restored to royal control, and a general pardon issued shortly thereafter for all but a handful of the rebel leadership, provided some measure of relief for many, but at a price of acknowledging insurgent sympathies. It is in this regard that Erasmo Seguín stands out. Safe in Natchitoches, when word arrived of the royalist restoration, he headed back to San Antonio, now accused Now accused of having joined the rebellion. Erasmo was offered the pardon that other repentant rebels accepted, but he refused the offer. Instead, thinking that his past conduct and well-known royalist sympathies would inoculate him from charges of treason. How did Seguín come to be considered a traitor to the just cause? What made him believe that he could receive real justice from what many of his fellow Tejanos and other Mexicans labeled a tyrannous and arbitrary monarchy? We are fortunate that the complete proceedings of the Crown's case against Seguín have survived in the state archives of Coahuila. The case lasted from late 1813, when Seguín was arrested and charged, until March 1, 1819, when Arredondo accepted his legal advisor's opinion that Erasmo should be cleared of the charges. The record is evidence that his gamble had merit. And just to be clear, Erasmo was not the only Bejareño who considered himself loyal to the viceregal government, who had lost property and had to defend his actions. For instance, José Antonio de la Garza, who also went to Louisiana with the same group of insurgents that included Seguín, had his property confiscated. Unlike Seguín, however, Garza did not incriminate himself by openly taking on an assignment from the rebel government, or, in what proved to be the most damning aspect of Seguín's case, by writing letters of reference from Natchitoches for the revolutionaries. Consequently, while Garza's case was quickly resolved in his favor and without the filing of formal charges, Seguín found himself arrested, charged, and tried for treason. The chain of events presented in the case file point to the paradoxical, almost chaotic circumstances that engulfed Erasmo and his fellow Tejanos in the decade-long Mexican struggle for independence. After Gutiérrez and the Republican Army of the North entered San Antonio in the beginning of April 1813, prominent royalist Bejareños were arrested, among them Erasmo, along with the European Spaniards who later were murdered by a faction of the insurgents. After about 20 days of arrest, the Bejareños were released, only to be rearrested a few days later. It was then that Seguín appears to have thought it best to cut a deal rather than to try to make an escape, as some others did. He agreed to accompany Tomás Arocha, who Gutiérrez appointed to travel to Louisiana in search of additional resources. Arocha abandoned his mission and returned to San Antonio, but Erasmo stayed behind in Natchitoches the rest of the summer, and in July provided the letters of introduction for Toledo and wrote to Arocha making excuses for not having returned. When word arrived of the royalist victory over the Republicans at the Battle of Medina, Seguín returned to San Antonio. He was placed under arrest in the home of none other than Juan Manuel Zambrano, who had led the counter-revolt in 1811. There he remained while the case got underway. Pedro Lemus, the prosecutor, took testimony from various individuals who had been jailed with Seguín, and even from Tomás Arocha, who apparently had accepted the government pardon. In late December 1813, Lemus issued his opinion that Seguín had failed to prove his defense of acting under duress in writing the letters, and advised a sentence of 5 years imprisonment, a lenient sentence given the hundreds of Tejanos who had been executed in the aftermath of the Battle of Medina. And this brings up another question, which we don't have time to today, which is even the parish priest brings up the fact that immediately after the battle, there are hundreds of executions and there's pursuit of the enemy and there's all this. And then later on, these other people who get pardons and who wander back into town, they're treated very leniently. So, and he wonders why after almost 9 months of hanging in the around the plaza, the main plaza, what is today the area around City Hall, why he cannot take the bodies and give them proper Christian burial when others have been treated so much better than these men. Anyway, another story for another day. A second phase of the case began when the full court-martial decided at the end of the month that the investigation be expanded and new testimony taken. Seguín was now confronted with 2 of the letters he had written from Natchitoches and asked to explain them. New witnesses were called based on Erasmo's expanded testimony, including 2 who were residing at La Bahia, what is now Goliad. None of the new testimony served Seguín well as far as Lemos was concerned, for, quote, what is certain is that the said Seguín was in a free country, that's Natchitoches in Louisiana, right, where the perverse Toledo had no authority whatever and consequently could not force on Seguín his depraved intentions. At the end of January 1814, Lemos again decided that Seguín should suffer 5 years imprisonment. Again, the court-martial met, this time calling Erasmo before them, and again they continued the case based on 2 letters from the previous summer written to Seguín by Apolinar Masmela, a Spanish merchant residing in New Orleans, which Seguín presented to the council. Masmela was familiar with San Antonio's commercial community and referred to Seguín as, quote, dear friend, expressing royalist sentiments, Reviewing this new information, the court-martial ordered Lemos to consider the letters and take additional testimony. Finally, in February, Lemos agreed that there were enough contradictions in the case that Erasmo should be released on bond while obtaining affidavits from Natchitoches regarding his conduct while residing there. Things apparently did not go well for Erasmo at first, without access to the income from the post office job and the government monopolies, and unable to leave the city to conduct business, and having his ranching property confiscated and his livestock gone, he found it impossible to provide for his family. It took Erasmo until mid-November 1814 to get permission to pursue whatever opportunities presented themselves, including moving the family to Saltillo, where he had relatives. I have yet to find evidence that Erasmo actually moved the family to Coahuila, but he did manage to associate himself with the merchant Sebastián Rodriguez, whose representative in Béjar Seguín became. Through Rodriguez, Seguín managed so much cash that Governor Armiñán was able to borrow 4,000 pesos to help supply the San Antonio garrison. Again, it just kind of proves that Erasmo's a man to be trusted, and that he is involved with all of these figures despite his compromised circumstances, so to speak. Under the difficult circumstances confronting Spanish Texas at the time, it took Erasmo more than 4 frustrating years to collect the necessary documents. Only in late 1818 could he finally present the affidavits that corroborated his version of events to the satisfaction of the Commandant General's attorney. In a long opinion dated February 20, 1819, Rafael de Llano concluded that, quote, the documents from Natchitoches lately presented regarding the time he spent there, the only way his conduct can be impeached, show that his actions always oppose the traitor's principles. He continued, consequently, I judge that he should not suffer any loss, either in his honor, his life, or his goods. I likewise feel that your lordship should pronounce him innocent of the crime of treason of which he was accused. Llano also opined that remaining property in government hands should be returned to him and that he should be allowed to file a claim for damages. In all of this, the Commandant General concurred on March 1, 1819. Seguín went about putting his life back in order. Among the first things he did was demand the return of his house, which had been turned into a public school. He eventually had Rancho San Juan Nepomuceno de la Mora returned to him as well. How much of the 9,793 pesos that he claimed to have lost in cash, debts owed to him, livestock, merchandise, and possessions during the Gutiérrez Seguín episode, including debts owed to him by his workers, his peones, is open to question. Like other Bejareños, whether royalists or rebels, he duly filed a statement in November 1818, including everything taken from him as a result of his imprisonment. Quote, "And my family violently thrown out of my house, who were only allowed to take their clothes, trunks, and one or two objects of veneration." And while he was rebuilding his private life, he began his return to public life. At the end of 1819, he was elected the first alcalde for the following year. And, of course, in February 1821, Governor Martinez appointed him commissioner to inform Moses Austin of the government's approval of his colonization project. More than that, Seguín carried yet another pardon for all Tejano insurgents who remained in Louisiana. He returned to San Antonio in July in time to be part of the head-scratching turn of events that brought about Mexican independence a couple of months later. Arriving in town with Austin, he was informed that the royalist governor, the town council, and the town's leading citizens had all sworn allegiance to the Plan of Iguala, a manifesto cooked up by the royalist General Agustín Iturbide and agreed to by insurgent leader Vicente Guerrero, who went on to become president. For the separation of Mexico from Spain under terms that declared both Spaniards and Creoles equals under Mexican Catholic monarchy. For Erasmo, as for other Bejareños, the plan ended formal divisions and made questions of their loyalty to one side or the other moot. And so, principal figures on both sides during the War of Independence wound up working together after 1821 to build a new Mexican nation and a new Texas. In fact, Seguín's trial contains the names of many of these individuals, including Royal Army officers Pedro Lemus, Luciano Garcia, and Antonio Elosua, Bejareño royalists José Antonio Saucedo, Ignacio Pérez, and Manuel Salinas, and Bejareño insurgents Juan Martín Beramendi and Francisco Ruiz. All of these and others who participated in the events surrounding the Casas and Gutiérrez episodes found themselves on the same side in fall 1821. Very different from what you learned about American history and the American Revolution, where the loyalists were either shipped off to Canada or had to go across the ocean or had to get the hell out west and away from people who really hated their guts, right? Well, that's not what happens in Mexico, at least not initially. The military men, like many other royalist officers throughout Mexico, transferred their allegiance to the Mexican army, and their service files do not miss a beat in noting the earlier service as part of their service records. Antonio Saucedo, Erasmo Seguín, Ángel Navarro, and other civilian royalists won elections and received appointments, sometimes with the help and collaboration with Juan Martín Beramendi, Francisco Ruiz, Gutiérrez de Lara, and other former insurgents. In this sense, the outcome of the Mexican War of Independence was different from what happened in the United States, where American loyalists were blacklisted, exiled, even worse. In another sense, the experience of being royalists, then Republicans, then, like Seguín, royalists again, might have influenced the fluidity of their subsequent allegiances as Federalists, Centralists, Mexican, and Texans. This certainly appears to be Erasmo's case, who went on to serve Texas deputy to the Constituent Congress that wrote the Federal Constitution of 1824, and as Mexican Federal Treasury agent in San Antonio until the eve of Texas independence. Between 1807 and 1840, Erasmo served Texas under three successive sovereignties: postmaster under Spain, congressional deputy and treasury agent under Mexico, and county judge under the Republic. He lived until 1857, so he was also a citizen of the United States for at least 11 years of his life. In all that time, he never once moved to a new country. His story is, therefore, a good vehicle through which to study and understand the paradoxical and ambivalent nature of being Tejano in the first half of the 19th century. Thank you.
Our next speaker, Jack Hebden Jr., is a partner, VP, and CFO of Baki Development Corp., also a Guenther descendant. Received his BBA from UT Austin, did graduate work in Wisconsin, and licensed CPA here in Texas. He is also a director as well as chairman, Audit Commerce Committee of C.H. Guenther & Son for over 16 years until it was sold in March 2018. Also heavily involved in Fiesta as King Antonio back in the day. Also currently serving as on many boards, but also interestingly enough, as you see in your program, an advisor to the Secretary of the Air Force, Chief of the Air Force, and Chief of Space Operations. Without further ado, our next speaker, Mr. Hebden.
Okay, it's on. Great. Thank you, Francis, and thank you all for having me here today. And I'm going to tell a story about my great-great-grandfather, Carl Hilmer Guenther. Most of what I know came from letters that he wrote home. He wrote home a lot over his life, and the family was lucky enough to get those letters back. And in 2001, at our 150th anniversary, we translated those letters and put them into a book so everybody has an opportunity to read and hear his thoughts. My grandfather, Ernst Schuhart, wrote a book in 1951 about the 100th anniversary, and Louis Fisher wrote another one in 2001 about the 150th. Carl was born March 1826. His father was Carl Gottfried Guenther. His mother was Joanna Guenther, and because his dad name was Carl, they called him Hilmer, and he went by that his whole life. He lived in Wiesenfeld, Germany, which is in the Prussian province of Saxony. It's kind of on the southeast side of Germany. He was homeschooled, and by the time he was 18 in 1844, he had become a member of the Guild of Master Millwrights in Sachsen. So he was going to go be a miller. That was his desire. And he gets to 1848, and he's restless. It's time to leave, and he wants to go start his own business. He can't do it in Wiesenfeld. He's got to go somewhere else. His father's trying to convince him not to go. But there were two things that were really driving this restlessness. One, his family had been sympathetic to the peasants. They were well-to-do, a family that's like a middle-class family today. And, the peasants in this part of Germany and even part of Europe, people were kind of kept in your class, and it was hard to get out of your class. And he was sympathetic to that. And there was a revolution that was starting, and he didn't want to be part of the revolution on the Prussian side. They were starting to draft young men. So that was driving it. Probably the bigger thing was he had a prearranged marriage, and he was not going to marry that girl, period. I don't care what his father said, he was not going to marry that girl. So he was working in a mill in Seitz, which is about 20 miles from Wiesenfeld, his hometown. And in the spring of 1848, he walked out one night and never came back. He went up to Bremerhaven May 5th, 1848. He gets on a ship and sails to America. He wrote his family a letter the day he left and said, "Hey, I'm going to America, and I'll get in touch with you when I get there." It was a slow sail, not a lot of wind that year. It took him 2 months. July 1st, he arrived in New York City. On the way, he'd met a man as now was his friend, Mr. Frolic. Mr. Frolick was going to come into New York and immediately go to Racine, Wisconsin. And he was trying to convince Hilmer to go with him, that being a miller, there's a lot of opportunities for that in Racine, Wisconsin. He wasn't sure. He wanted to check out New York, and he had heard he could make $2 a day. That was kind of a number that was always in his head, how much he could make a day. And so the next day, he goes to a boarding house that Mr. Frolick, a friend owned, and friend found him a job, a carpenter's job. If you're a millwright, you're a carpenter, you're a builder, you're an engineer, you're a scientist. I mean, you have all these skills. And so he thought he was going to go be a carpenter and make $2 a day. Well, no, he was making 50 cents a day, and he wasn't a carpenter. He was hauling wood. And by lunchtime, he quit and went back to the boarding house. And he hooked up with Mr. Frolick, and they worked their way to Racine, Wisconsin. So he took the steamer up the Hudson River through the Erie Canal and across the Great Lakes. They had to work along the way. If they got stuck for a few days, they'd work and make some money. But he ends up in Racine, and he's there for about 2 years. And while he's there, he's trying to figure out how he's going to build a business. He doesn't have any money. He finds out that his sister got married, and his father, back in those days, the woman was endowed. When you got married, it was more than looks. It was the endowment that the wife had. And the father had given the sister $2,000. So he started this campaign of letter writing asking for his inheritance. And he kept telling his dad, if you give me $2,000, I can expand that 10 times. Well, after 2 years in Racine, he tried a few things and never happened. He finally agreed to go home. But he wanted to go see New Orleans on the way. So in those days in Racine, you get to Chicago, and there's a canal system that went to the Mississippi. He sails down the Mississippi River. And on the way, he meets Mr. Herman. Now, Mr. Herman is a plantation owner outside of New Orleans. And Mr. Herman was sort of his mentor. And Mr. Herman had really talked to Hilmer about going to Texas, not going to Germany. You ought to go to Texas. If you want to be a miller and you want to have your own business, Texas is the place to go. In fact, he told Hilmer, you can make $3 a day in Texas. So Hilmer was pretty excited about this. So he writes a letter to his dad in New Orleans. It says, Dad, I'm not coming home. I'm going to go to Texas. And in the letter he told his dad, he said, Dad, Texas is a place where a man can really make money. And a man can make $3 a day. So he buys that ticket from New Orleans to where? Indianola. Indianola was closer to San Antonio. He gets to Indianola, gets off the ship, and he's got to get to San Antonio. There's a wagon train going, but he doesn't really have the money to buy a wagon or ox or a horse or anything. So he's got to walk. But he goes with the wagon train because that was protection, particularly at night. There's still Indians around. There are Indians that are everywhere. And so he works his way to San Antonio, gets to San Antonio in January of 1851. He checks into the German office in San Antonio, and they say, oh, we need a mill. There's an opportunity for you at Fredericksburg, Texas. Fine, he heads up to Fredericksburg, Texas, and they're willing to offer him, guarantee him that he'll make $4 a day. So he's really excited now. $4 a day. They're going to give him 3 workers, 3 sets of oxen, and 3 ox carts. All he has to do is buy the land and build the mill. Easy, right? So he works his way down, looks around, finds a piece of property 3 miles west of Fredericksburg on the Live Oak Creek. In fact, when he wrote the letter to his father to describe the land, he said, Dad, it's the most beautiful water you've ever seen. The rest of the land's not very pretty, but it will be someday. But what's key to it was that piece of land sat 12,000, as he described it, 12,000 paces from where it hits the Pedernales. Now, when you're a miller and you're trying to capture water, when rivers turn or merge, there's lots of power. And what they would do those days, they would build dams and force the water into what they called a mill race, or a small canal that connected the water wheel, and that's how they got their power. So the dad did send money, paid $800 for the land. His dad did send some money, not $2,000, but did send some money. And by the end of 1851 and 1852, the mill's up and running. He grinds flour and he sifts flour, which is a little different, that you get a purer product. So very quickly, he was the preferred flour in town. Now, part of his problem was you can only mill if you have wheat. And so he started going out into the surrounding area of the farmers and contracting with them. If you grow more wheat, I'll buy it. In fact, this paper got so good, the farmers could go to the store and buy goods with his contracts. They knew they were going to get paid. Life's great. He meets Fritz Poppy, who is kind of a leader in Fredericksburg, and he goes to dinner one night, and there's a young lady there, Dorothea. He looks at Dorothea. Man, I'm going to marry that woman. Only problem was Dorothea was 12. So, but he's a patient man. He's been patient in his life. He's going to wait. He's going to get there. He keeps building his business. Coming into 1855, he's now added 2 more wheels. He's now turning 3 wheels, so he's grinding on 3 wheels, not 1. He's also added a lumber mill. They need lumber, so when you don't have wheat, you can keep your mill busy. He had a log cabin on the property, was there when he bought it. He's now building a new home. In fact, today, the log cabin and the home, and later on he builds a warehouse, still sit on that property today. And today it's the 1851 winery. But those buildings are still there. He begins to date Dorothea, and by October he marries Dorothea. Life's great. He wrote home and told his father, life could never be better. I'm making $5 a day. You know, it's all laid out for his dad. A drought comes, 1856, 57, a drought comes. They're kind of running low on wheat. The water level's running low. He's thinking about converting to a steam-powered mill. And he starts going around the community and telling people that he's thinking about doing this. And there's some merchants in the community that kind of told him they weren't going to compete against him, but they were hearing about what he was saying, and they're going, hey, I think we're going to do it too. And so they did. He got mad and left, packed up, sold his, he had a sizable estate. At that time, I think he got $6,000 for everything. He packs up, goes to San Antonio. He buys a piece of property on the San Antonio River just south of town. It was farm land that was owned by the Alamo, and the church was now selling off excess land. And he buys 15 acres. It was on the San Antonio River back in those days. Today, the river goes in front of the Guenther house. Back in those days, it went behind. And it was at a turn. So again, he could build a dam, and he could take that raceway down. Got the house built. His father died while he got there, and he got a letter that said, your inheritance is $4,500. You've already spent $2,500 of it, so I'm going to only send you 2. So, but he had $2,000 coming. He built the house. He had the equipment, had the material. He couldn't get the mill open. He couldn't get it built. He didn't have money for the labor. So he goes to Seguín. We heard about that earlier. He goes to Seguín. He sits down with the Alsatian farmers and said, look, you guys want to grow wheat. You can grow lots of wheat. I'll buy it. All you have to do is come to San Antonio and build my mill for me. And they did. They came down, they dug the raceway, they built the mill. He's up and running. We're now getting into 1860. He's deciding now he wants to change his strategy. So instead of milling the wheat that comes, I want to buy all the wheat I can, and I want to produce all the flour I can sell, which was a different strategy. He's ready to kick off that strategy in 1861. What happens in 1861? Civil War starts. He did okay during the Civil War. He was exempt from service because he was a food manufacturer. He sold flour to the Confederates. For a while, he couldn't sift the flour. He ran out of silk, but he finally got an idea. He'd go buy wedding dresses and from people that needed money, and he used the silk from the wedding dresses. He also, and I don't understand, he never really explains how he did this, but he sent a lot of money with friends back to Germany and put it in the bank in Leipzig. He did not trust the Confederates. He didn't trust their currency, and so he did that. 1865 comes. Now, by 1865, he has 5 kids. There's Fritz, Arthur, Louis, Amanda, and Marie. And a few years later comes my great-grandmother, Matilda, and Earhart. So he had 7 kids total. He's got a big family to feed, but he's ready to go. He's got lots of capital. He's got money in the bank, and he starts his new strategy. And the business just zoomed. I mean, it just took off, and By the time you get into around 1870, he's built a north mill upriver by the HEB headquarters where the arsenal was. He's built a mill up there. And 1877, something really big's happening in San Antonio. The railroad's coming. And he's starting to put in his mind that I am not going to be hurt by that railroad. I am going to benefit from that railroad. And so he began to retool the mills. The water wheels had to leave. Water turbines came, which is a much faster process now. The equipment's we're moving away from stone grinders to steel grinders, from gear-driven mills to belt and pulley mills. And he does all that. 1877, the train shows up. 15,000 people spend 2 days in downtown San Antonio watching the train. Must have been really exciting. At that same time, Fritz, his oldest son, Fritz and Arthur, are coming back from Germany. They'd gone to Germany to be educated. They're coming back. They come into the business, and he decides to rename the business from Guenther Milling to C.H. Guenther and Sons with an S. He does great. You know, this strategy works, and he's sending product out all over the state now. He's really growing the business. In 1894, Arthur, his second son, Arthur, decides to marry a young lady whose dad was an investment banker. And Arthur and his brother-in-law decide to open their own mill, Liberty Mills. And Helmer's not happy about that. He understands his son's sort of a free spirit like he was, but he doesn't like that. And so he's trying very hard to figure out ways to make this kind of work. He formed a cooperative at one time, and they would work together, but Arthur's flour wasn't very good. And his was better. It was given him a bad name. So he finally sues Arthur, and Arthur sues him. Fritz gets sick, and Fritz dies. Lewis, the third son's now back in San Antonio, but Helmer had started Southern Ice, and Lewis was running the ice business. So Lewis was busy. And what's he going to do? He's tired of this. He's getting old. He's tired of all this. So he convinces Earhart, who'd gone to Washington Lee, was a lawyer, to come run the business with him. He reincorporates the business in 1898. That corporation still exists and runs today. It's the oldest corporation in Texas. And he renames it C.H. Guenther and Son. He leaves that S off. The other thing he did is he came up with his idea, I'm going to quit calling my flour Guenther flour, and I'm going to brand it. So he came up with Pioneer, White Wings, Magnolia, White Oak, brands that we know today. The second thing he did is he put his picture on the bag. So today, Pioneer's trademark is the old man's picture. But he didn't stop there because he had a large Spanish population, not only in San Antonio, but he was selling down in Mexico. He puts under his picture El Viejo. Oh, man. He wanted everybody to understand exactly whose flour they were buying. By 1899, he felt good. Business was good. Earhart was ready. He was ready to take over. He died in October of 1902 at the age of 76. Dortea had died a few years prior to that. Earhart took over the business, and we all know the rest of the story of C.H. Guenther and Son today. You know, still in existence after 172 years, still operating on that same charter with the state of Texas after 121 years. Today, it's an international business. C.H. Guenther, the family ran the business until the early 80s, and then we started hiring professionals, and the family kind of took more of a board position role with the idea of growing the business internationally, and we did. And today, there are factories all over the United States, Canada, England, Belgium, selling products into France. Probably 85% of the business today is not that grocery store business that you see. We're selling to the major providers: McDonald's, Burger King, Waffle House, food service, Benny Key, Cisco, U.S. Foods, and we're selling product now all over the world, primarily through McDonald's. The McGriddle sandwich, if you've ever had one, they're a little high in calories, but they're good. That's the only product that McDonald's has that they don't own the patent on. C.H. Guenther owns that patent. And the flavor crystal that goes into them, We make 100% of those flavor crystals, and that's the only product in the world that's 100% anything with McDonald's. So I think Kilmer would look down today and say, you know, this is a great legacy and a really great business, and it's continued, although the family's no longer involved in it, it still sits right down here on Broadway, and it still is a big contributor to this community. So thank you.
And you can take a seat up there. So we'll go ahead in the few minutes we have left to take some questions. And we'll speak directly in the mic so you can be recorded.
Jack, I was just reminding myself the joys of Lenten luncheons at St. Mark's Church with the biscuits from Pioneer Flour Mill.
So not really a question, but gosh, it is certainly making us hungry. Got one right over here.
Well, thank you so much for your great story. And I just wanted, this is another comment, because I think those of us who have grown up here, it's just, Pioneer is a big part of our lives. So I live in the Camp Street lofts, and so each morning we face the tower. And so that's our weather vane. So I look at the flag and say, the wind's coming from the southeast, the wind's coming from the north. But it's just so wonderful to have that there and to have a working industry that's been there all these years and not the complete gentrification of the neighborhood. You know, in other words, it's still got the businesses and people, and it's just wonderful. Thank you, guys.
Anybody else? Right over here.
I have a cute story to add. I have a cute story to add. Martha Stewart had this competition on cornbreads, and she had cornbreads made from all these different companies, and there was an award for the one that won. Well, we all knew that we made every single one of those cornbreads.
Well, gosh, this is definitely taking on a culinary flair here. I feel like I'm at the Pearl. I will just kind of interject here and just ask Frank real quick. It seems like 1813 really is a turn in terms of for many Bejareños. And in the context of Mexico's independence against Spain, you have the transition from rebel leadership under Hidalgo to Morelos. And I'm wondering, what really made that switch for a lot of Bejareños? Is it because of the involvement of Americans coming in? And perhaps secondly, I've read like there were also Native Americans as possible allies, but I was never really clear about that.
Well, I don't think many of the people involved were very clear on it either, and I'm not trying to be facetious. The problem is we want to paint the story in as black and white terms as we can, and the fact of the matter is that unlike the American Revolution, which is pretty much has two sides to it, the problem in Spanish America, and I say Spanish America because you have to remember that it's a large chunk of South America, Central America, and then the southern end of North America are all part of this Spanish Empire, and that the fall of complicated this actually is. And what happens is Napoleon replaces Charles IV and his son Ferdinand, who becomes eventually Ferdinand VII. He replaces them with his brother Joseph. And Joseph Bonaparte is not really beloved of the Spanish people or anybody on the other side of the Atlantic. And so the dominoes fall very quickly. And they fall in different directions, so they're not knocking each other down, so it's not a nice, neat row of knockdown dominoes. Dominoes are just flying in all kinds of direction. A war of independence breaks out in Spain. That's what they actually call it, the Spanish War of Independence, because we're trying to get independence from Napoleon Bonaparte with the assistance of the British. And so there's this rivalry over whether Wellington and the British actually carried out that Spanish independence, or the Spanish did most of the fighting and the British just took the credit. So, you know, you have all those issues going on. On this side of the Atlantic, Buenos Aires declares its independence. Bolivar is trying to get independence for what he calls Gran Colombia, which are the countries of Venezuela, Ecuador, Colombia, Ecuador, Venezuela. In other words, there is a lot of confusion over who is the proper sovereign. Most of these people have been loyal to the king for hundreds of years, even when they haven't liked the way things were being managed. But there's still this ideal of the sovereign. And in Mexico, the way it worked was the city council of Mexico City declares that because the king has been deposed and there's an illegitimate person on the throne, sovereignty reverts to the people, and sovereignty is expressed through the ayuntamientos, through the local government. And local government in Mexico is going to have its base in Mexico City, which was the capital of the viceroyalty. So the Spaniards in Mexico City don't like the idea of the locals gaining control of things, so they actually carry out a coup. They overthrow the city council. They place an octogenarian retired general on the viceroyal seat, and they say that no, we owe our loyalty to the king, and the king's sovereignty is expressed through the viceroy, not the ayuntamiento. So you see there's a political battle now over who you owe your loyalties to. By the time that arrives up in the north, it's okay, are we siding with the viceroy, or are we siding with these rebels who say that they're loyal to the king but they don't recognize the viceroy? And so it's not Spain versus Mexico, it's the viceroy versus the local representatives of the king. And so a lot of what happens starts there. By the time you get to Gutiérrez de Lara in 1812, 1813, the idea that we should owe any connection to a royal government is being questioned. And so the idea is we need a king, we should be a monarchy, because anything else is anarchy. And so we need a monarch, but we need a monarch that we pick and not that somebody else picks. And so that's where the division happens between what happens in 1811 and what happens in 1812.
And that's a kind of complication there that just repeats itself. And I love how, in hearing our speakers talk about Castroville and talk about Guenther, and how many of these French and German, other European settlers become enmeshed in that, and it just kind of grows even more.
It's happening, and it continues to happen throughout the first half of the 19th century. I mean, the German Revolution of 1848, or the European Revolution.
Well,
actually,
Frank, let's take that into the lunch, because
we got to go to lunch. Okay, we got to go to lunch. But there's a revolution in 1848, and it drives a lot of guys over here.
Thank you very much, and thank you, everybody.